Welcome to the third seminar of Green Story. My name is David Goyes. I am a researcher at the Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law at the University of Oslo. Today, three indigenous intellectuals, spanning both generations and geographies, come together to share their knowledge and talk about their people's cosmovisions and environmental ontologies, and reflect on how westernized society can learn from indigenous ways of being. We do this because nature, including ourselves, is constantly worse off. The climate is increasingly changing, temperatures are rising, nature and its diversity are in retreat. More than human animals, either domesticated or wild, are suffering, and we, human beings, are also suffering as a result. Our three panelists will share how their indigenous cosmovisions frame and understand what caring for our sacred nature looks like. Patti Krawek is an Anishinaabe Ukrainian writer and speaker of the Lac Seul First Nation territory. She is the founding director of the Nikinagana Foundation, co-host of Medicine for the Resistance, and has authored the books Bad Indians Book Club, Reading at the Edge of 1,000 Worlds, and Becoming Kin, an indigenous call to unforgetting the past and reimagining our future. Helena Lindmark is a Sami wisdom keeper and trauma specialist from the Sápmi, Sweden. Her work bridges ancestral knowledge and contemporary society through healing, leadership, and community development. Drawing on indigenous perspectives and lived experience, she explores the relationship between people, place, memory, and belonging. She contributes to international dialogues on climate, sustainability, and indigenous rights, bringing a grounded perspective on humanity's relationship with nature and the relevance of indigenous knowledge in addressing today's global challenges. Vika Tupi is an indigenous activist and actress from the Tupi peoples living under today's Brazil. She is the creator and director of the podcast Sementes Urbanas, Urban Seeds, a collective created by three indigenous peoples to reclaim their indigenous identity. Vika's main project deals with how to be an indigenous person in the contemporary world. With them, we will discuss four main topics. First, a brief presentation of these indigenous peoples, their history, their current situation, and their cosmovision. Second, the general interaction of these indigenous peoples with nature, following their cosmovision. Third, how they see westernized or Western society treating nature. And fourth, we're going to end up with a reflection of how Western and westernized society can learn from indigenous ways of being. Before we begin, let me ask the audience to please send in the chat any questions that you may have, and Helena, who is a researcher at Green Story, will gather these questions and transmit them to the panelists after our initial conversation. So let us start with the first topic, which is a brief presentation of your people, current situation, cosmovision. You all represent different indigenous peoples in different continents. Patti is in North America, Helena is in Scandinavia and Europe, and Vika is in Latin America. I want to start with Patti. If you can tell us a little bit about your people, who you are, and what should we know about your history?
Okay, yeah, like you said, it's a big question. I'm really happy to be here and excited to hear from the other panelists as well. And I really appreciate the global perspective that this panel is providing to people. Anin Bujo Wabnan Anangonkwe Indigenous Adik Indodum Obishko Kang Dunjuba Niagara Dunjuba Ojibwe Anishinaabe Kwayandao. When we introduce ourselves in the language, we're taught to introduce ourselves with our name. So my tax name is Patti. My clan is Caribou. And I get that in the Ojibwe are patrilineal, so we get our clan from our father. If you don't have an Ojibwe father, the different community groups have other ways of assigning you to a clan, so that you have a broader community to be part of. My boys are following my clan because they don't have an Ojibwe father. I'm a member of Lac Seul First Nation. In Canada, we are, we're identified by the government as whether or not we're Indigenous, and then, we belong to a particular reserve. Canada has reserves. The U.S. has reservations. It's just different name, same thing. So I am Ojibwe Anishinaabe. We are part of a large group of Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe people actually cover a good bunch of North America around the Great Lakes, north and south of Lake Erie, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, and Superior. So the Ojibwe Anishinaabe are around the coast of Lake Superior and into kind of extending outwards into the states and provinces around that lake. We have experienced a lot of harm. We live in urban centers as well as in these more rural reserves. And we have experienced a lot of harm, right? The reserves themselves, we were displaced out of our original places where we lived. We tended, the Ojibwe Anishinaabe tended to follow where the wild rice grows. That's where our community is generally centered. And then we would go hunting, and so moving around, like a lot of people do, right? Like a lot of people move around for work. We still move around. People still move around a lot for work. I think all academics move around for work, right? And so it's not a mark of being a primitive people. It's just you go where the work is, and that's what we did. But generally around areas where wild rice grows, that seems to be where we centered. So we got displaced from those places because the settlers wanted those places. So we got displaced into reserves through treaties that were not always forthcoming. We understood the treaties as a way of sharing land, and the Canadian government understood the treaties as a way of taking land. So, and in their own documents, they recognize that we understood these things differently. Their intentions were to take the land, and we thought that we were just sharing the land. So they knew this was not a miscommunication. After the reserves and reservations came into play, then they started Indian residential schools, taking our children from our communities and putting them in boarding schools where they were taught to be Christians, they were taught to speak English, they were forbidden from speaking their languages and practicing their traditional ways. After the boarding schools, residential schools closed down. They started closing down at the end of World War II. And then our children were still being removed from our communities through the child welfare system. We have something in Canada very famously called the 60s scoop, because there was a social worker who said we would just go into the communities and scoop them up. And the 60s scoop became the millennial scoop, and 25% of children in foster care in Canada are in are in foster care. We only make about 6% of the population, so that's very disproportionate numbers. We have an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We have now expanded to be missing and murdered Indigenous relatives because our men go missing as well. Our Two-Spirit people go missing as well. And the police don't take these missings seriously. We go missing into prison. 50% of the prison population of the women in Canada are Indigenous. Half of the Canadian prison population of women are Indigenous. In some provinces, 80% of the prison population is men, or like our Indigenous men who are in prison. Like I said, we only make up 6% of the total population. So this is ridiculous. This is removal and displacement. But despite all of that, we have our stories, we have language, we have each other. And this is what we're learning. We're resuming, we have prophecies about picking up what was left behind, picking up our bundles, and that is what we're doing. And despite everything, I love how vibrant and connected we are to our stories, to how it helps us understand our place in the world and what our responsibilities are to each other, and the latecomers. In Northern Ontario, we call white people the latecomers. It was kind of like, what took you so long? We always knew that you were out there. We just didn't know where. Yeah, so I like that they call them the latecomers as opposed to the newcomers.
Okay, we lost Patty when she was already talking about the positives and not only the harms that they have suffered. So I think we can use the space. She has traced the trajectory of colonization, the exploitation by the state, how they created reserves, how those reserves was a way of taking over the lands, how they also created Indian reservation schools for kidnapping the children, these assimilation programs, and how they keep kidnapping indigenous peoples, be it through foster homes or just incarceration. When she comes back, she will tell us again the positive sides. She was highlighting the stories and the languages and we have, but now we can perhaps give the word to Helene, who can also perhaps introduce herself and introduce the peoples that she represents. Please.
So I'm Helen, and I come from above the Arctic Circle in the north of Sweden. And my heritage goes from Sweden, Finland, and to Russia. Quite diverse. I grew up in a very diverse family because many of us Sami have to make research of who we are because it was split during 1600, I think it started, because we also had the effect of religion. But I would like to say something that when I find my lineage and I really understood the nomadic personality inside of me that is so living, it took me to go through all my 4 generations where I come from, the reindeer herder Sami people and the forest Sami people. And Sami is stretching over Norway, Finland, and also Russia and Cola Peninsuela. And unfortunately, I was not able to learn the language because it wasn't okay in my family to announce that you had the Sami heritage. There were some of my siblings of my father that took that space, and some was totally Swedish. So it was quite many, and there was also another minority people that is called Meänkieli. And what I really have seen is that our ancestors that lived before us, they lived in harmony and balance with nature. They had a relationship to nature. They had a relationship to all living species. Because in my home, there was no ever any questions about if anything was asked, where can we find it? Yeah, nature provided it. So it was something that also my grandfathers and grandmothers was very clear with, but also that we learned to read, to have a communication that is not by words. Then we have 5 districts of Sami in Sweden, and they all have different languages, of course, but I am in the North Sami. And it's also, I lived in the South Sami, but it's totally different. And what we're seeing today is that how the world is today, the separations get bigger because the destruction of land, because I also lost my own land to the mining company. But for me, it's most importantly today, how can I keep tradition? How can I keep knowledge? How can I keep the language and everything that is rooted in the land to give further to the coming generation, to my grandchildren? And that I do through storytelling. I think that is important. But storytelling also by questioning and allowing, like, why do we care for a tree? Why do we care for water? Why is the sun so important? We have 6 weeks of light. We have 6 weeks of dark. And we are living by that cycle. So we learn to adapt to that, which means that the year on the North Sami side, it starts in May when the reindeer babies comes. And we're following that cycle. And every season in between the seasons are, I would say, for me, understandably by myself, the most important, because it's the reflection and the integration and the preparation for the next season. But today, with the climate change, the seasons are moving. Everything is moving. But what we can see is with nature that nature goes to storm, nature goes to fire, nature goes to destruction of the mining. But nature has a memory. It remembers how to come back, how to see, how to deeply be. And I think that is something that humanity totally all over in the world have forgot. And what is also is that I feel that in a political way, we are seen as a minority people in Sweden, but we are not ratified. And that is also, so we are fighting a government today where they say, for example, yes for mining. And that is very, very, very hard because we don't take more than we need. And what we see is that what will they do with all the material they take off from the ground? People get sick of that, but what will they do? And do we bring the humanity closer to themselves by creating more material? We don't see that. So it's more of we're trying to keep in family the traditions and telling, so much we can about how it's been and mostly the importance of listening, deeply listening to nature, deeply listening to the silence, because up in the north, the silence is its own language.
Thank you, Helena. So I think the two of you have set the stage quite nicely by explaining the harms that you have suffered, how be it through mining or reservations. And I think Vika has also a lot to say about that from the experience in Brazil, and which I think it's common to many other peoples in Latin America with different experiences but similar technologies. So welcome, Vika, and please share with us the story that you want to share with us.
Xandecoema, Xandecaruca, bom dia, boa tarde a todos. Ixé, Vika Tupi, eu sou Vika Tupi, eu sou o que a sociedade não indígena enxerga como artista, e eu sou a 4ª geração da minha família vivendo numa zona urbana.
Good morning, everyone. I am Vika Tupi. I am what non-indigenous society would call an artist. I live in theater and audiovisual, and I'm the 4th generation of my family that's living in an urban area.
Eu venho de um povo, o povo Tupinambá, que foi o povo do primeiro contato, na época da invasão dos colonizadores. E antes desse período de invasão, nós ocupávamos grande parte da costa litorânea de Pindorama, que hoje se conhece como Brasil.
I'm from the Tupinambá people, which is the first contact people. We were the first to come in contact with the invaders during the colonizing period. And before this period, we used to live in the coastal line of Pindorama, which is now known as Brazil.
Por conta dessa área geográfica que nós ocupamos e por sermos um dos povos de primeiro contato, se não fosse a grande resistência cultural, na força das retomadas, na força da espiritualidade, nós teríamos desaparecido completamente. Nós teríamos deixado de existir.
And precisely because of this geographical position we occupied, we came very close to cease to exist. It was through our spirituality, our resilience, our cultural resistance that we continue to exist to this day.
Nesses mais de 500 anos de processo de colonização, o meu povo foi sendo empurrado dos seus territórios para as áreas de favela, para as áreas de periferia das zonas urbanas.
In over 500 years of colonization, my people were removed from the areas and pushed to the outskirts and favelas of urban areas.
E recentemente nós tivemos uma vitória com reconhecimento e homologação da terra indígena da aldeia Itapuã, do povo Tupinambá de Olivença.
Recently, we had a victory in the judicial system from an official ratification of the Itapuã village, an area to the Tupinambá de Olivença people.
Mas os nossos direitos não estão garantidos, eles não estão assegurados. Inclusive, eu queria usar esse espaço para fazer uma denúncia, porque o povo Pataxó, que é um outro povo indígena da região do estado da Bahia, que é o estado de onde eu venho, está correndo risco de perder o seu território tradicional, a Aldeia Velha, que é um território muito antigo, de muita resistência, de muita luta, um território que inclusive já foi reconhecido e já foi homologado pelo Estado brasileiro, mas que por estarmos também em ano eleitoral aqui no Brasil, muitas disputas políticas estão sendo evidenciadas, né? A gente está sofrendo muita pressão da especulação imobiliária e do agronegócio.
Yeah. Our rights are neither secure nor guaranteed. This year is an election year in Brazil, and that's why I would like to use this space to make a denunciation. Currently, the Pataxó people, which have a sacred land called Aldeia Velha, or Old Village, their territory, which was already officially ratified, is being removed from them. They're being evicted for this location. And this is because in election year, Brazil has a big agribusiness and real estate speculation. And they're using this pressure to remove these people from their land and to use it to make their own business.
O juiz Pablo Baldivieso deu menos de 2 meses para o povo Pataxó desocupar a Aldeia Velha, que é o território de muitas famílias indígenas.
Federal Judge Pablo Baldivieso has given less than 2 months to every single person there to evict the area, and it's a land of a bunch of families, a big group of people who will be evicted in less than 2 months.
E reiterando que esse território já tinha sido reconhecido e já tinha sido homologado, então nunca temos descanso, mesmo depois de alguns avanços e algumas conquistas.
Yeah. This territory had already been officially ratified, but we can never rest. We have to constantly be fighting for our conquest and everything that we need to achieve.
E para o meu povo Tupinambá, a relação com o chão que se pisa é muito importante. Porque para nós, toda manifestação da natureza, tudo tem espírito, né? E é muito disso também que parte nossa cosmovisão.
Yeah, from my people, the Tupinambá, the ground beneath our feet is really important because for us, everything has a spirit. We are connected to everything through these spirits. And a big part of our worldview comes from this belief of the spirits that habit the things.
A maior parte dos territórios Tupinambá hoje se encontra no estado da Bahia, que é um estado também que abriga muitas retomadas.
Yeah, a big part of the Tupinambá land nowadays is in the state of Bahia, which is also a state of the retomadas, the land back movement.
Thank you, Vika, for explaining the trajectory of your community and your people, and again, the different injustices and abuses that you have experienced at the hands of the government, colonizers, corporations, and so on. And I think we opened the webinar by talking about the effects of colonialism, the issues of discrimination, the erasure of memory, the takeovers of land, the disappearance of knowledge. But also along the way, we have been talking about the resilience, the resistance, the tools, the knowledge, and everything that indigenous communities also possess. So I think to keep moving forward in our conversation, I think we can move from what some people refer to as deficit approaches, everything that has been taken from indigenous peoples, and move to what indigenous peoples do and have and know. All this power and knowledge and creativity that's still there, because that's beside denouncing what we have denounced, we are going to celebrate these tools and these resources. And Patti was mentioning that she was saying we have our stories, we have our languages. So I want to invite Patti back to the conversation, and maybe if you can tell us something about the second point, about what is the interaction of your people with nature, what is the cosmovision in general, and how do these stories play a role in that?
Yeah, so as I'm listening and they're talking about, I'm hearing a lot of displacement and removal, and it's all like the same thing happening to all of us, right? The problem with their strategy is that they don't take our stories seriously. Our stories, our traditional stories, and we have, the Ojibwe are very blessed, privileged to have an archive of stories that were documented in 1906 before residential schools and Christianity altered so many of our stories, as we kind of sanitized them. And in these stories, we take nature and the natural world, the animals, very seriously as beings in their own right, who have a history that far precedes our own, because they were here long before we were here. We have stories that talk about layered universes, spirit world and our world, and the way they interact with each other. So when we get displaced, we know how to put down roots in other places. We know how to build relations with the other beings, the natural world, the other people who are in those places. We know how to do that because that's contained within our stories. And so when we get displaced, that's why we continue resurgence in all kinds of ways. That's why land back is such a big thing that we're all talking about, that we want our relationship with our land back, and our land, the land that knew our ancestors. But through these stories, and the Anishinaabe have a story of migration, where we started in what is now northwestern Ontario and moved east. That story may or may not be the full story, but it's contained in some of our records. But what we know historically as well is we also moved from the east to where we are now. So whether that was a homecoming or a migration is up in the air. So movement is part of all of our stories, whether we're moving to follow the rice and the herds, or whether we're moving through displacement, or just moving because we got itchy feet, So movement and building relations with the natural worlds that we find ourselves in is very much a part of our stories. And so they thought that by displacing us and erasing us and, putting us in prisons and cities where we're surrounded by concrete, that concrete is rock, it's stone. It's not unnatural. It's part of our world. And our creation story began with a conversation between stones, right? The sound of the rattle, the conversation between stones. So even when you put us in these terrible places, we can find a way to connect with the beings. That's something that Helena and Vika both talked about, was that nature is alive. All of these beings, these natural beings, they have spirit. The computer on which we're speaking is made from the natural world in a horrible extractive way. But these are still relatives. And that's a serious thing, right? That means we should be taking these relatives seriously in how we engage with them, and how how they help us to engage with each other. We know that trees communicate through those mycelial networks, right? And we do the same thing. There's actually a great Star Trek episode that has, that kind of gets into that. I'm not going to nerd out about that. But that's just, to me, that's how our view of the natural world and the way that we engage with it, the way our stories teach us to engage with it, helps us to survive all of this violence and displacement, because we know what to do if we listen to our stories. I went to a friend of mine and asked her a question about the afterlife, and she says, Patty, for the third time, read that archive. Everything you want to know, everything you need to know about how to live is in that archive. And so I was like, fine, okay, I'm going to do that. And then my blog became an investigation, of these stories. And I do love them. And I love them because they take animals seriously, right? Like we have stories about crawfish who went to war. And it's not like a Walt Disney movie imagining these, anthropomorphized animals. this is their own history. And I don't know how we got their own history, but they have their own governance, their own rules. And we're not above them the way the Western world thinks we are. We're part of them. And I think that's really cool. And that gives me a lot of possibility of what we can do. And that we don't have to, like you mentioned, the deficit way of thinking. We don't have to become trapped in that. Because wherever we are surrounded by living spirit beings that we can connect with. So that's, I really hold on to that. I really hold on to that.
Thank you, Patty. And this, in the work that we have developed with indigenous communities in Colombia, from Colombia, and we see something similar. The deep spiritual stories that every aspect of nature, every living being has, that it's not only humans who have a sacred, deep spiritual nature, but it's every aspect of nature, of this network of life. And this is also what I have been listening in this conversation. I think Helen was saying something similar about the awareness of the importance of all elements in nature. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about the Sami cosmovision and how the Sami see nature and the place of humans within nature?
So the Sami cosmovision is that there are no separation. We are the nature, so it lives within us, as the elements lives within us. So all relations, from the reindeers to the ravens to the eagles, everything lives in our memory, how they survived and how they track their tracks that sometimes been destroyed. How do they find new tracks? But it's also about using the senses, the senses of seeing, but mostly about deeply listening to what is really the water showing us, what is really the water, what are we hearing from the water. And when it comes to spirituality, it has been a very, very hidden part of our lives, because it was totally forbidden and taken from the religions, and they were saying of the drum is the devil's beat, or the yoik was, because the yoik is not a song that we sing with words. It is a communication with the trees, with the nature. It's a communication with our herds. So it's so been wrapped away. So it's just going in a kind of a more gentle way and humble way, and talking about that the beat of the drum is the beat of Mother Earth. So when a child is born, you beat the drum and the child feels that it's whole because it hears the heartbeat. And that the frequency of the water in the womb is important, because it's the frequency that we gonna carry our whole life with, we will interact into. But the most important, I think, is that what I see is that to everything we do, when it comes to handcraft, when it comes to work with the earth, or it's really that it's a kind of a relation we put by doing the action. We are putting in we become one with the energy of the earth. We become one of what we are doing, if we are doing, and that becomes something that will become very specific. And then we also have this kind of seeing that as the moon is telling us a lot, the star is telling us a lot, but also that the ones who leave this earth as human beings, they are not gone. They are still there. They're just in other place on the Saivo. So it's really very. So we don't see any separation with life and death. life and death is in one cycle. So every evening we go to bed, we leave something, and we wake up to a new day. And that process is also very, very important. But to reorienting and starting to remembering, it is to be really, why do we feel like we feel? Why do we feel lost? Because what we are now, many people are tracking back to the Sami roots, and because they have done a DNA or something, but they feel that, I feel like you were saying, Patty, that we are traveling people, we are nomadic. Why can't I? Why am I changing work, or why am I more home in nature than I am in the city? And how can I find? How can we find a balance in the strong movement? But for me, it's to be a living bridge, by being a living bridge in a very transparent way of trying to translate and finding a new dialogue where we can bring back the old stories, but also opening the history that has been taken from us. But today I say, when I work, I say that we all have a universal library that is lived within ourselves, that is lived through many, many generations. And that is the biggest resource we have. And to tap into that is but tap into it to take responsibility. And if we don't respect ourselves, we will not respect nature. We will not respect anyone else. So it's about finding that back to the respect and the responsibility, that if I throw plastic in the sea, some people can say, does it matter because it's just one piece? Yeah, but in 10 years, it will be toxified water. So it's really how we to start to rethink, because the disconnection hasn't happened during the 2000 or 1900. The disconnection happened long before. But to have that understanding today in our culture, we're trying to find new dialogues, new rooms, and especially for women, to find what is the role for a woman in a Sami community where the man is a reindeer herder. The women carry life. She's holding the man, she's holding the family, she's holding the container of knowledge for the child. And the man is providing by holding the tradition alive. So we are really looking into the different roles, but also opening. I think it's very important to express yourself today, that to feel that you're trying to get people to do that. You have the right to express yourself because it's your truth. No one can say that this feeling is not wrong in you, because that is what many of the young people feeling.
Thank you. That was beautiful and so wise. And as I heard, as I listened to that, I was thinking, there's no divide between the outside and the inside. Nature is in us. We are in nature, and I also thought that Patti underscored one of the, I don't know if to call it superpowers or just natural powers. And Patti was referring to these stories, how we can be reborn all the time if we carry our stories. And you were also, Helen, talking about these powers that we have, the repository of knowledge and wisdom that we have within us, but also in the senses, in listening and connecting. So I think those are very powerful ways of presenting cosmovisions, and I'm also now very interested in listening to Vika and how she describes, or how she can present to us the cosmovision of her people.
A sua cosmovisão.
O meu povo, desde muito tempo, viveu perto do mar. Então, o ciclo das marés sempre determinou muito o nosso ritmo de vida e de trabalho.
Yeah, we are people who have lived near the sea for a very long time. So the cycle of the tides has always determined our way of life, the rhythm of our work.
E o ciclo das marés é determinado pela lua, que é a nossa mãe Jaci. O sopro de vida, energia vital, nos é dado por Guaraci, que é o sol.
Yeah, the cycle of the tides is determined by the moon, which is our mother, Jaci. And our life force, our life spirit, is given to us by Guarani, the sun.
Guaraci.
Guaraci, sorry.
E todos nós somos filhos do nosso grande pai Tupã, que é o deus do trovão, do céu, do clima.
And every single one of us is son of Tupã, the great father, which is the god of thunder, the skies, and the weather.
Ou seja, a nossa cosmovisão, a nossa espiritualidade, que muitas vezes é vista como algo menor, como lenda, como folclore.
Yeah, our vision of life, our way of life, is a lot of times seen as folklore or legends.
Não é só lenda ou folclore, é a nossa espiritualidade, é como a gente vê o mundo. E é incrível como a visão indígena da nossa relação com o todo, com esse ecossistema que nos cerca, é parecida em diversos lugares do mundo.
Yeah. It's not just folklore or a legend. It's how we see the world, how we connect with it. And it's truly amazing to see how in different parts of the world it's so similar in so many ways, how we see the world.
Inclusive, eu acho que eu nem vou me estender mais sobre esse aspecto, porque senão eu vou ficar me repetindo. A Paty e a Helene também já trouxeram isso muito bem.
Yeah, I'll not even extend what I had to say because it's so similar that Patty and Helene already said so much of what I would say. So I'll just repeat myself.
Nós não vemos o ambiente que nos cerca, que inclusive aqui no Brasil existe um termo, meio ambiente, que a gente não vê sentido nisso. A gente não enxerga como um recurso. E não só também como a parte de um todo, a gente enxerga realmente como um parente, como um avô, como um bisavô, como uma mãe, como um pai, como um irmão.
Yeah. Here we don't see the environment as a resource. In Brazil there is a term which would be translated as like half resource to refer to the biosphere, which we don't see many sense in it. We don't see it as a resource, we see it as a parent, as a grandfather, a father, a son, a mother.
E se relacionar de verdade com o ambiente em que se vive faz parte também do que já foi falado aqui, que é a escuta. E é uma escuta que não necessariamente tem a ver com a audição, tem a ver com sentir e se relacionar de verdade com o ambiente que se vive.
And to create a relationship with the environment, it's about listening, but not the literal hearing, but to listen to the environment, the spirits, the stories.
Mas a gente também acredita que é possível se relacionar de verdade com aquilo que tem vida. Então, por mais que nós também somos seres nômades e que nós nos deslocamos, nós não consideramos que é tão possível se relacionar da mesma forma com o concreto, por exemplo, com o asfalto, com os prédios.
Yeah, for us, we can create a relationship with anything that has life. And even though we are also nomadic people, we don't believe you can create as deep as a connection with concrete, asphalt, the urban areas.
Eu gostaria também de citar um exemplo que é muito sagrado para a espiritualidade do meu povo, que é o manto tupinambá, né? Porque essa nossa visão de relação com a natureza que nos cerca, que nós fazemos parte dela, se estende também para os nossos artefatos tradicionais.
Yeah, I would also like to use as an example the Tupinambá mantle, which is a sacred object for our people, and our relationship with the land, the nature, it also extends to our sacred artifacts, our objects.
O manto tupinambá, ele é feito a partir das penas do guará vermelho, que é um animal muito sagrado para o meu povo e que é habitante do mangue da Mata Atlântica.
The Tupinambá mantles, they are made using the feathers of the red guará, a sacred bird of the mangrove, which is a real special animal for my people.
Durante muito tempo, esses mantos, que se não me falha a memória agora, foram 11, ficaram expostos em museus da Europa, né, incluindo o museu na Dinamarca.
Yeah, For a very long time, if I'm not mistaken, 11 of those mantles were in European museums. One of them was in Denmark, for example.
Então, parece que é mais importante para o mundo esse manto estar num museu na Europa do que perto do seu povo.
It feels like for the world, the Western world, it is more important that these mantles are in a museum in Europe than close to its people, to its relatives.
Porque o mundo ocidental enxerga ele apenas como um objeto.
Yeah, because for the Western world, this mantle is just an object.
Recentemente, depois de muita luta, nós conseguimos que um exemplar desse manto viesse para o Museu Nacional, aqui no Rio de Janeiro.
After a very long fight, one of these mantles, just one, was sent from the National Museum to Rio de Janeiro, here in Brazil.
O que ainda não é ideal, porque o ideal realmente é que esse manto estivesse com o povo Tupinambá, com o povo Tupinambá de Olivença em seu território.
And even though this mantle is now in Brazil, it's still not ideal because this mantle should be with the Tupinambá people, in their land, their territory.
Porque ele é o ancião de um povo, ele é um bisavô, ele é um parente, e ele sustenta toda a espiritualidade de um povo.
This mantle is like an elder, an ancient guardian, a relative. It what gives the entire people its spirituality.
Thank you for, again, powerful words and for what you have taught us about your history and the way of seeing life and relating to life. We have now gone through the harms suffered by indigenous peoples across the world. We have moved into the cosmovisions and the sources of strength of indigenous peoples. And we can now move to something that I find fun and amusing, which is the indigenous critique of Western and Westernized society. There are historical records that show that since the first interaction between the colonizers and indigenous peoples, indigenous intellectuals have been mocking the colonizers for their absurd ways of living, for their crazy veneration of objects, for their crazy respect of hierarchies, and for valuing what should not be valued, and for abusing what should be respected. So I want to also listen from you, from your peoples, from your community, from your own thoughts. What are the main criticisms that you would address to Western society and to Westernized society? Because we know that this Western way of seeing is spreading. So what would be the criticisms that you would address, and also when it comes to how Western or Westernized society treats nature? I'm going to take the same order as usual, and I'm going to give the word to Patty.
Thank you. I was struck by what Vika was just talking about, about the sacred objects being, in prison, just like we are, held in museums where maybe we get free admission to go and see them, but they're still not with us and taken seriously, or, kind of with their relatives. And, and I'm hearing so much similarity between what we're saying, all three of us, and it really shouldn't surprise us that people who are connected to the land, waters, air, the night sky, would get similar lessons, similar beliefs that shift because we're in different places, but basically have the same thing. And it does my heart so much good to hear that. So I was raised in an evangelical Christian family, and so I'm unpicking all of that stuff out of my brain. And I saw, on a TikTok or something, somebody was asking if Adam and Eve died because of the apple, what about the animals? Like, would they have died anyway? Or did they just start dying because of Adam and Eve? And that sent my brain down a real rabbit hole, because this is, I think, the crux of the Western worldview, right? Death entered the world because it's a punishment. It's a terrible thing. And the stories in the Hebrew text don't tell us about whether or not the animals would have died anyway. Like, it's all very centered on the humans, and nature exists in this reading of these stories. And I know Jewish people don't always read it the same way. But in those stories, nature exists to serve the humans, right? Humans were created last. Nature exists. Everything that came before exists to serve the humans. And the Ojibwe understanding doesn't work the same way. Nature doesn't exist to serve us. We were created last, which makes us the most needy of all creation, because we need the plants and the animals and the water and the land and the sky. And like, we need so much. All of these things that existed just fine without us. But of course, now we're here. And so now we're part of that web. So it's not like we could just disappear and everything would be fine. We are now, as every layer of creation came into being, it became part of that web, and now we're all interconnected and we all need each other. And so it's a much different way. When I wrote Becoming Kin, I was looking for the place where everything went wrong, in terms of contact. And I was looking for the place, how far back does it go? Where did things go wrong? And I wound up at creation stories, because we understand our place in the world very differently. The West sees death as this punishment, as a thing to be vanquished. And our stories actually do talk about how death entered the world and talk about how the animals figured things out. It was like the Nana Bujo, who created us along with his brother, said, you know what? And they're going to have a limited life, because otherwise there will just be too many of them. And so we're going to create spirit world. And so death is a transformation. It's a shift from one thing to another. Of course, I just got news this morning that one of my relatives just passed. And of course we grieve the loss. This is, a gaping wound in our lives when somebody dies or somebody leaves us because they go missing into prison or they go missing into child welfare, or, any of those things happen. It's not that we don't take death seriously as a loss, but we understand it differently. We understand that things die so we live. Right. And it's a much different way. And I think that's where the West really went wrong, is seeing themselves as the top of creation, as the lords of the earth, for whom the only time we think about creation or the natural world is when it is when it comes up against us and we're like, oh, I need more water, or I need more this, or I need more that. I need to extract the cobalt for the phones. I need to build a dam to have electricity. That's the only time the Western mind thinks about nature. Whereas, to go back to our stories, when we think about nature, we have stories that don't even contain humans. Like I talked about the crawfish, and there's raccoon stories, and there's all kinds of stories that don't include us at all, because we understand that nature also has its own relationship with everything, that it has its own life apart from us. And so when you have that kind of understanding, that death is part of life, that it's not an enemy to be vanquished, it's part of, then it becomes a very serious thing. You don't treat it casually. You take the life around you seriously, because you may also be called to do that at some point as well. And ultimately we do, right? We go to the ground and we become worm food. And you had talked about us being part of creation. And I saw a presentation once about how we ourselves are stone. We ourselves are rock people, because when we eat, we take up minerals from the ground, and then we return those minerals to the ground. And that's, I think, where the Western world goes so wrong, because it sees itself as disconnected. It sees nature as something that exists in service to us. And that goes all the way back to their origin story and the way that they read it, which I don't think it has to be read that way. And even if people don't think of themselves as Christian, those ideas have so permeated Western philosophy and Western ways of thinking and doing. And now we've got billionaires who think that got a trillionaire now, who thinks that they're just going to peace out and go to Mars. It's like, why? Why? This world is perfect for us. Why do they have to do that? And they just don't care. They just aren't invested in this world because it exists to serve them. And if they can find another world that will serve them better, then that's what they're going to do. But we don't feel that way. We know that we are rooted to this place. And Vika talked about the importance of being connected with our own lands. And Helen did as well. That yes, we're a mobile people. Yes, we're in cities. Yes, we are always surrounded by relatives. But we need to go home. I need to go home. I need to go home. Home is far away from me. It's a 3-day drive. But I need to go home regularly. I need to put my feet on that land. I need to put my hands in that water. I need to look at the night sky and see the constellations as my people understood them, right? The Great Fisher instead of the Big Dipper. And we have a whole story about that, about how that constellation came into being. So yeah, I think that's what I wound up doing with Becoming Kin. I've just followed those threads right back to the Western creation story of how they understand their place in the world, because that ripples out in so many ways. And they don't see the natural world as being alive. It's just there to serve them. And when it's gone, it's gone. We know that our pets will be in the next world with us. They still have to worry about it.
Thank you, Patty. Yeah, I think kind of you took the criticism back to the sources. And I think Helen was also talking about, maybe you want to expand on that one, maybe you want to talk about other criticisms of Western society. The one that it was very clear from what you have said already is how we have forgotten what we know, and that kind of we are forgetting the inner wisdom that is inbuilt. Would that be the most representative criticism, or what would be the critiques that you would make to Western society, and also in how it relates to nature?
So I would like to start with that by living in Europe and by living in Sweden, where Sápmi is a part of Sweden, but also been always dominated by by governments, by claiming land or other things, but also by violence against women and things. But I want to go back to that, even if I'm always a little bit, the Western world is seeing the world outside of themselves. They are not interconnected. They are not in here. For me, home is in here. It's not a place, it's within myself. And I think that is a cosmovision we have, that home is here. So wherever we go, we always have a relation to the place or to, but Western world had come in since century back. It's so many splits when we look at colonizing or we look at in assimilation of people, but it's really what's really feels that also I also grow up with 2 other minority people in my blood. It is the split and also the Swedish blood. So it's that kind of coming back to the right relationship. And the criticism I would say is that when they was taking our village for mining copper and gold, we asked, how long will this contain? 7 to 8 years. And everyone needed to take out. And the thing is that, will they need what they took now for in 10 years? I don't think so, because the development going very fast. But it is a system in the world that are so separated from the indigenous world. But what I see when the criticism is that I've been asked many times to speak in going to places, but I am not an attribute. I'm not going there as a showcase for them to connect to the spirit of the land, to get the knowledge or get the insight. Because I was recently in a call of that, and I said, I can come and I will listen to the water what it has to say, but the water is saying I will not share it with you because this is not to be shared with you. And then I wasn't going. So it is really that, and I think this is the commercial exploitation that I have really, that it is that it's so easy to be trapped today in this westernized thinking, because instead of being in relation with nature or stewarding it, it becomes ownership, and we own it, and we become greedy about it. It's like my tree, it's my land, it's my things, and then it really shows that the disconnection is totally so disconnected since century back. But how can we find that way of, and I think that the biggest defense system that also, because if I'm trying to talk, I talk from the heart, and sometimes when they're interviewing me, they use a lot of academic words, and I said, please don't do it, because let me just speak what comes from the heart. That's kind of, because it's not only me who's speaking here today, it's my ancestor who's speaking here today with you all. It's the voice of the earth that comes through me. But it is building up now a world of domination where they just want to show that they are a part of the green movement. But what is the green movement? The green movement for me is a green colonialism. And instead, what's happening is that the criticism is also that what happened in our community is that it becomes split. It becomes conflict in between the community, because everyone wants to hold to their own belief system, their own tradition. And then it comes, when we're looking at finance, then it comes that perspective in. So I think there's many layers of but I am a woman who try to not to think of criticism. I'm a woman of trying to see how can we find this way of interacting it in the Western world society. How can we make them understand? So in some occasion when I talk for water, for example, I give them a gift. I say, how is your water today? And everyone looked like I say, I don't want your answers. And then I start to talk about what the water contains, that they have the original structures, and why it's important that you all have our own frequency. So I think it's how it's also to look over kind of, because it is, I don't like it when they want us as a fashion window or an attribute. I'm against that. But if you really want to listen what I have say, then I'm there, and then I can speak. But I can really feel when there's this senses of they want the confirmation that they have indigenous people from all over the world, and then they get a check-in of fundings, or they get a check-in of money, more money to what they are wanted to. But what are they going to do? Are they going to rewrite our stories? That is my question. What are they going to do with it? Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. It's so many powerful criticisms, and I think this adds to the tradition, which has always been not about discarding or creating a divide or an abyss, but just pointing into the absurdities and how those absurdities can be redressed and reworked and rethought and so on. So we have the original criticisms of Western society for the selfishness, for the material greed, for the lack of generosity, for the hunger for the spotlight, and the irrational respect for hierarchies. And those critiques come from the 16th century, and I think they have extended until today, because Western society keeps having many absurd sides. And I know Vika is part of a network of intellectuals and activists who have also been at the vanguard, ahead of showing and underscoring many of the absurd practices. So I want to listen now from Vika. How do you see Western society, and what would be your main critiques?
Principais críticas aí.
Como eu disse anteriormente, eu sou a quarta geração da minha família vivendo numa zona urbana. E eu venho de uma área da cidade de Salvador, a capital baiana, que chama Cidade Baixa,
As I mentioned, I am the 4th generation of my family who lives in an urban area, and I came from the city of Salvador, the capital of Bahia, from an area called Lower City, or Cidade Baixa.
Salvador é dividido entre cidade alta e cidade baixa. A cidade alta é a parte rica, é urbanizada, porém mais arborizada, com infraestrutura, saneamento. E a cidade baixa é a parte mais pobre, onde vive grande parte da população preta e indígena da região, e é uma área de mar e mangue.
Salvador is split into the Upper City, Cidade Alta, and Lower City, Cidade Baixa. The Upper City is the wealthier, with more infrastructure, tree lines, and sanitation systems, proper infrastructure, while the Lower City is an area of beaches, mangrove, and where most of the black and indigenous population lives.
Por conta do avanço colonizatório que deixou a nossa população em vulnerabilidade social e econômica, não preciso nem me aprofundar em relação a isso, as habitações na Cidade Baixa, as casas, foram construídas de uma maneira não totalmente regular, algumas áreas totalmente regular, mas toda a construção que é feita na Cidade Baixa não é ideal. E vale ressaltar que isso não foi uma escolha.
Because of the colonization process, most of the people were pushed to this area, and I don't even need to expand myself on how the colonization was brutal for the people. And most of the homes in this area are completely irregular, in illegal areas, with dangers for the population, and it was not a choice. It was the only area they had to live, to build their homes.
Então, quando chove, as bocas de lobo, os esgotos enchem, a maré enche e causa um alagamento de toda a Cidade Baixa. E isso é muito recorrente, né? E coloca a população exposta a doenças, a invasão das suas casas pela água, a destruição de suas casas e até risco de vida.
When it rains, the sewers, they get completely filled and the water invades the home of the people. And they get exposed to diseases, to life-threatening situations, accidents, and this is not an uncommon occurrence. Like it happens almost every year, every rain season, the street flood.
Esse alagamento recorrente acontece em toda a Cidade Baixa, mas eu quero ressaltar aqui o caso da favela de Alagados, que ficou conhecido mundialmente, primeiro nacionalmente, através da música da banda Paralamas do Sucesso, que foi também uma denúncia, e depois mundialmente com a visita do Papa nos anos 80.
While the entire lower city gets flooded, I would like to highlight the case of the favela known as Alagados, which means drowned. This favela was nationally known by a song of the group Paralamas do Sucesso, which was also a denounce of this occurrence. And then later in the 80s, the Pope came to visit, and it brought international attention to this issue.
Com toda a visibilidade e repercussão mundial da situação da favela de Alagados, a partir dos anos 90, todo mundo, literalmente, queria resolver o problema da favela de Alagados.
With this international visibility in the 90s, everyone in the world, like every part, wanted to solve the issue of the Alagados favela.
Mas a solução que o mundo ocidental encontrou para resolver esse problema foi mais urbanização, foi colocar mais concreto, mais asfalto, foi simplesmente matar e soterrar o mangue e construir uma comunidade habitacional em cima, prédios, né, conjunto habitacional.
But the Western world saw as a solution greater urbanization, filling the mangrove with soil, concrete, asphalt, and they built a lot of habitational complexes in the area, but they were really poorly constructed.
No final das contas, esse conjunto habitacional que fazia parte de um projeto chamado Novos Alagados nem contemplou toda a população que vivia naquela área. Eles acabaram sendo expulsos, esbulhados para outras áreas, outras localidades de periferia também, de favela também, e além de ter matado a biodiversidade daquele mangue. Então não resolveu o problema e a Cidade Baixa continua alagando até hoje.
This rejuvenation project, which was called Novos Alagados, or New Alagados. The housing complexes they built could not provide homes for every single person in there, so a lot of the population was just evicted and pushed to other favelas, other slums areas of the city, and they also killed the biodiversity of the mangrove. So at the end of the day, they did not solve the problem. The lower city still floods to this day, and a lot of people just lost their homes for nothing.
Quando eu era criança, eu morava na praia, mas eu não podia tomar banho no mar da praia em que eu vivia, porque a água estava sempre imprópria para banho.
Yeah. When I was a child, I used to live near the beach, but I could never swim in the sea, because the water was always considered unsafe for swimming.
Então, quando eu e minha família queríamos tomar banho de mar, a gente tinha que se deslocar para outra praia, para outro lugar bem mais longe de onde a gente morava.
Yeah, when me and my family, we wanted to go to the beach to enter the sea, we had to travel far away from where we lived because we had no sea close to us.
Quando eu cresci, eu aprendi que existe um termo para isso, né, que é racismo ambiental.
Yeah, when I got older, I learned the term ambiental racism, which is what applied to the situation.
E just a moment.
A questão do Porto do Comércio, que era o que poluía.
Então, com a consciência do que eu aprendi sobre esse termo do racismo ambiental, eu fui enganada a vida inteira, a minha família foi enganada a vida inteira, como se a culpa da poluição da água daquele mar fosse nossa. Como se alguns lixos que se jogavam no mar, como as necessidades que algumas pessoas em situação de vulnerabilidade faziam, poluíam aquele mar de forma que a gente não poderia utilizar aquela água. Mas isso, na verdade, é uma mentira, porque quem de fato poluía aquele mar eram os óleos que saíam dos navios do Porto do Comércio, né? Era a poluição das fábricas da região, que não fazia parte, inclusive, de alguns dejetos que eram absorvidos, que eram orgânicos e eram absorvidos de maneira natural pela praia.
Yeah, when I got conscious about environmental racism, I learned that I was tricked, that I was lied my entire life, because the water was polluted not by the community, not by ourselves, but by the port of Comercio, which its ships spilled a lot of oil in the ocean, and also by the factories in the region. And our natural, everything that we threw in the sea, all the trash, all the spoils, they were naturally absorbed by the nature itself. But what the port and the factories produced, that's what was polluting the seas.
Thank you, Vika, for sharing these experiences with us. And I apologize for taking those stories and that powerful way of conveying knowledge into insights. And because now what I want to do, I'm going to go a little bit off script, and I want to ask the three of you one question. Because what I saw in Vika's stories is Western society is very reckless, and it has no problem with subjugating other people. It doesn't hesitate if they benefit from something in victimizing others that may be humans or more than humans. And also what I saw in Vika's story is that Western society lacks flexibility. She was saying the solution for the problems of urbanization was building more. So it's more of the problem, right? And Helen and Patty have also underscored other problems, including the divide, the split, and so many others. And I want to ask a free question to the three of you, and then you can decide who wants to talk first. Because what I wonder is, since we know how harmful Western culture and ways of being is, why is it spreading so much? why is it being superimposed over indigenous territories? Why is it somehow taking over the souls and the minds of so many people? How can we understand this? I know it's a difficult question, but I would love to hear what are your thoughts on this issue. And then you can decide who wants to talk, because I just wanted to throw the question there.
Eu acho que nos é muito perguntado o que, inclusive foi também uma pergunta que vocês trouxeram, que é o que podemos aprender com os povos indígenas. Mas eu acho que é muito mais urgente a gente entender o que a gente precisa desaprender, né? Que é o nosso conceito sobre desenvolvimento, sobre o que é evolução, sobre o que é progresso.
Yeah. One question that was also brought by you guys was like, what Western society can learn from indigenous society? But what's more important, what we can unlearn from it. Because our concepts of development, progress, evolution, this needs to be unlearned and relearned from indigenous societies.
Eu acho que está muito presente na nossa sociedade e é uma das causas desse nosso consumo desenfreado, desse nosso desespero por ter as coisas, que é o medo da manhã. Então, essa sociedade do capital introjeta muito isso na nossa cabeça, que a gente precisa ficar desesperado pelo que vem amanhã. Então, com essa incerteza e esse medo do amanhã, a gente é estimulado a entrar nesse sistema para trabalhar cada vez mais em prol dele, para que nós possamos acumular capital, para que nós estejamos assegurados no amanhã. Porque a gente tem medo do que vem amanhã.
Yeah. One thing that is really worrying about the Western society is this worry of tomorrow, the fear of tomorrow, the anxiety. Because this gives us a sense of we have to always be producing things, working, capitalism, buying things, consuming things. And this disconnects us with nature, with time, because our perception of nature itself changes with that.
O trabalho, inclusive, me trouxe para a cidade de São Paulo. Hoje eu moro aqui. E essa cidade foi nomeada pelos povos que habitavam essa região de Piratininga, que em tupi antigo significa peixe seco, se referindo ao movimento de estiagem dos rios, né, dessa região.
Yeah. Work, for example, made me move to São Paulo, which is the biggest city in Brazil and was known by the people who lived here before the city as Piratininga, which means fish that dries, referring to the dry season of the river itself.
E essa cidade tem 3 rios que atravessam ela. É o rio Tietê, o rio Pinheiros e o rio Tamanduateí.
The city has 3 rivers that flow through it: Tietê, Pinheiros and Tamanduateí.
E essa cidade tinha um enorme potencial de ser, inclusive, uma cidade fluvial.
Yeah, the city could use the rivers as a fluvial city.
Mas as pessoas que invadiram essa região com sua fome do amanhã e com a fome de garantir o amanhã, preferiram transformar essa cidade em um cemitério de rios.
But when people invaded this area and their hunger for tomorrow, their fear of tomorrow, they, instead of using the rivers, they turned them into a graveyard of rivers.
What do you think, Patty and Helena? What can we add to that mix of fear as well and the anxiety of being?
Yeah, I think their stories don't offer them any other way of being in the world. And I don't just mean their traditional stories like the creation story in the Bible, like I talked about. I mean, any of their stories. Like when you even, I love horror. I watch horror movies all the time, all day, every day. I'm watching horror movies. But their horror movies are about that fear of the unknown savage, right? Who's going to come in and destroy the nice, almost always white suburban family, or they go out into the woods and they get destroyed by the people, these savages that are living in the woods. I think their stories just, they lack imagination because their stories are all variations on the very same theme about how we are scary and nature is scary and the outside is scary and the ocean is scary and everything is scary, and they always have to defend themselves against it. And you see it in all of I'm not going to say all, because there are a lot of writers who are writing differently. But that's really what I was on about. You mentioned my book, Bad Indians Book Club, is the importance, and I talk about, the importance of reading stories from marginalized people. Our traditional stories, yeah, they should know the traditional stories of the land where they are. They should know those stories, because those stories came up out of the land. But they should also know the stories of the people who were displaced to that place, right? So not just the people who were displaced from it, but the people who were displaced into it, other marginalized people, because they're also trying to find a way at home, and they're bringing their own stories with them of place. And so I think if they can do that, and a lot of them are, I mean, I have conversations with them every day. A lot of them are, they're learning from our stories, our fiction, our nonfiction, because we investigate history differently. We write about science differently. The Anishinaabe language is very concerned, it's some people would call it a verb-based language, but it's more process-oriented. It's more around how things interact with each other, where English is very noun-based. It's about things. It's identifying this thing and that thing, where Anishinaabemowin is how do these two things relate to each other, right? And that is a very useful language for quantum physics, where English is not a very useful language for quantum physics. And so our science is valuable and worthwhile on its own merit, not, and I think if they take all of our stories seriously, our stories about not just our traditional stories, but all of our stories seriously, that will give them the imagination to imagine other ways of existing in the world. Because right now, their own stories do not. Their own stories, like Vika talked about, they're scared of everything. They're scared of the world. They're scared of the water. They're scared of everything. We have stories about eels who migrated from the Caribbean way up into Nipissing. Like, eel carried so much wisdom from the Caribbean all the way up to Northern Ontario, and now the canals have shut that off. We all live under the stars. It's not scary. And so then our horror, like I say, I love horror. So then our horror movies are also different, because when you get pushed into the dark, you make friends with the things that are in the dark. And so we're not scared of the edges. We're not scared of the margins. We live in those places. We've learned how to make friends with them. We're scared of other things. So our horror is different. And that's what I'm on about in Bad Indians Book Club, is you got to read other people. You got to read other stories, because you got to learn how to understand the world differently and expand your imagination. And, a lot of people are talking about Octavia Butler these days and Parable of the Sower, and, how accurately she predicted this current political moment. But she was just paying attention. She was just paying attention to what was happening in the 90s and saw the trajectory of it. And so that's where I think they lack imagination, which is why they just keep doing, like Vika talked about, they just keep doing the same thing over and over again. If a small city isn't working, then let's make a bigger city. It's like, why do we do that? Because they lack imagination. That's going to be my bottom line. They lack imagination. Their story doesn't give them any other options. So they got to expand and read marginalized writers. And that will help them imagine other ways of existing in the world.
You were also a little bit ahead and I'm going to get back to you, because I want you to expand on that for the message and what can Western society learn from Indigenous communities. But before that, I wanted to listen to Helen and see what's your take about why this Western way of being is so widespread, so popular, and so powerful.
I think, like both Vika and Patty said, is the scarcity is one part. But it is that the separation of, this is not my story, this is not my family, this is not what happened. And one thing is that to lose something is a testimony, but the testimony is not in the head, it's in the body. It's in the body as we are children of Mother Earth, so it affects us inside. And to tell stories kind of going from the head into the heart, because people are so focused today in the Western society of creating something that they can hold on to, something that they can touch, something that is either visual or kind of giving a logical explanation, so they have a proof if someone is asking them. And I think that is something that I see that, do we stand up for ourselves? We can see the diversity in the different parts of Sápmi. No, we really don't have that voice in Sweden as they have in Norway, for example. It's a different, and it's in Finland, there's another story. And in Russia, there's another story. But the thing is that the Western world, they are focusing that they are not a part of the nature. Nature is just an objective, something that is outside of them. And when you say you want to have a relation, you want to find your roots. It needs to go inside of yourself to start listening to what is moving inside of you, what is there, not what is because that is also when I tracked my lineage to know who I really was, because I didn't find a place in the world. And then I didn't understand, because I lived by the mining my whole life. I grew up with the mining. I didn't understand how they could do this to her, to our mother that is holding us. And to have that understanding, but then also coming to the day when you lose something, how did it affect you? And it affects you physically, it affects your health. And that is, and especially also when I say to people, please don't go there. For example, they ask me for sacred sites. I'm very, very cautious of showing that, because that is not an attribute to see. If you go to a sacred site, you go there with an intention why you are going there. And this is I think that the Western world is put it up in a box, like the guy who became the billionaire, like it is up in the space, but it's not my problem. And they have no ground. So instead they are running around and in a way totally emotionally empty and without any responsibility. And the most they are afraid of that is that to be without money. And what do we really need? We have everything here. Money is energy as everything else.
Thank you. So we are now reaching the last topic of the conversation. At the end, I'm going to invite you to let me know and let everyone know what you learned from each other, which I'm sure I'm just learning so much from the three of you. But I'm also curious about in this conversation with your sisters from other continents, what you're learning. But before we get there, I want to get to the topic, which we have somehow covered. But it's about what Western society can learn from indigenous ways of relating to nature, if you can say that, and maybe if you can say something about the person attending this event, the one who has to go to work, who has to pick up children, who has to go to buy groceries. What can that person take from this conversation and apply in their daily life? So both you can choose if you want to give something more broad for society or more for the everyday life. I'm going to continue the usual order, and I'm going to give the word to Patty.
Okay, yeah. So that's also a big question. So in Becoming Kin, so it was the first book that I wrote because I wondered, like, where did things go wrong? And when everything bad happens, any racist thing happens, whatever, everybody says, oh, that's not who we are. That's not who we are. And I'm like, no, it's totally who you are. And let me prove it. And so that's what I did for 5 chapters, was I proved that was in fact who they are. But then I had, the last few chapters about, like, what can we do? What can people do? And every chapter ends with a task, with a thing that people can do. Because every chapter brings up, like, big feelings about displacement, about, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, about environmental issues, about all of these things. And then I'm telling them to rebuild their relationship with land and with each other, and then act in solidarity. And people want to know how to do that. And a lot of that is hand-holding. I think people can also figure it out. But the very basic thing is, who are the original people of where you are? You can do that. Nativeland.ca, the website, will show you who the original people, and it's all across the Americas. It's extended into Europe. It will also ask yourself, who has been displaced to this place? Who else lives here who isn't like me? And that's a question that we can all ask, right? Whether we're marginalized or not, whether we have been displaced into this place or not. What are their lives like? Where are they in our lives? Pay attention. Is the only place you ever see them is in the service industry? Are they on your bookshelf? Are they in your movies? And, pay attention to that stuff. People can do that. And then people can begin the work of bringing us into those places, buying the books that we write, not books that are written about us, by other, by people with with a different interest in telling our stories than we would have in telling our own stories, right? For example, I grew up, like I said, in an evangelical household, reading, a book called, it's called Through Gates of Splendor, and it's about these evangelical missionaries who went to Ecuador. And then I picked up a book called We Were Jaguars, which partway into the book, I realized this is the exact same community, but it's told from the perspective of an Indigenous activist who grew up in that community. And it was a completely different story than the one that I grew up hearing about, right? Because I grew up learning this very westernized, sanitized version. So it's important for people to do that. So once you know who's missing, you got to do the work of figuring out how to put us back in, whether it's through books, movies, just starting to have conversations. And then once you've started doing that, if in your place of employment, you can start looking at policy. What are the policies of your workplace? And how might they be impacting people who aren't in the policy room? And we can do that at the local government level, at federal government level. We can start looking, because policies are meant to seem neutral, but they're not neutral, right? Policies always privilege a certain way of living over another way of living. So once you've noticed who's missing, and you've learned something about them, and this includes people who are genderqueer or, have different disabilities or, are disabled by the world that we live in, are excluded in all kinds of ways. Then you can start thinking about how do those policies impact and what can we do differently? And then we can start thinking about solidarity actions. We can start thinking about organizing and how do I be in solidarity with these people that I am now aware have been pushed to the margins and have been displaced and treated violently. And I heard a speaker talk about the importance. We always talk about allyship. We want to be a good ally to this or that. And allyship can always kind of devolve into that kind of white savior. I'm going to save these poor people who are having this terrible life. And we don't want that. No, we don't need to be saved. We save ourselves. Mostly what we need is for Western society to get out of our way and stop, flooding our communities or putting us in places that get flooded. And when Vika talked about that, we also have communities that are relocated for 2 or 3 weeks every spring because the reservation floods and you can't live in it. And so every year they get displaced. And now it's the wildfires. So every year the whole community gets flown out and lives in hotels in places, other places, that's so disorienting. And that's environmental racism. Absolutely. What I heard this guy talk about was, let's talk about coalitions instead. So instead of you coming into our communities as a well-intentioned ally, you're going to help us. Your responsibility is to your own community to bring the things that you have now learned and organize the soccer club or your reading group or your church or your school or kind of wherever you are. Organize them, teach them the things that you are learning so that when we have a political action, whether it's to deal with Grassy Narrows and the mercury poisoning there, or the flooding of the favelas, or, the mining in Sami territories, then that community can come together with our community, follow our lead, and actually make things different. And I really liked that model. I really like this idea of coalitions rather than allies, prioritizing the needs of the most vulnerable in that moment. So, and in order to do that, you got to take us, they got to take us seriously. They've got to take our traditional stories seriously. They have to take our contemporary stories seriously. They have to take our worldview seriously and the way that we exist in the world. They don't have to agree with us. And I heard, Miriam Kaba, she's an organizer in the US, and she always talks, it's movement building, not matchmaking. We don't always have to get along, but we can work together towards common goals. And that is really important. And then we learn things and we go back to our communities and we kind of continue that education. And the other thing I'll say is it's not a both sides thing. We don't need to be educated about white society, about Western society. We have been educated for hundreds of years against our will about the philosophies and beliefs of Western society. But I can't say the same thing about Western society. Whatever they know about us has been filtered through all kinds of layers. So that would be what I would say. They need to take us seriously, and then they need to start building and taking these actions. And it starts very small, and it eventually becomes something much bigger.
That reminds me of what a colleague mentions about fractals, how it starts growing and reproducing the ideas, and that's very powerful.
I love that image of fractals.
What would you say? Yeah. I think it can be powerful, connected to what you just said, where the image starts. What is the original source? Because that has a lot to say. It's not about any image, but where do we come from? And I think that's also part of the message of We Are Jaguars. That we don't need to be saved. That's the title in Spanish. We don't need to be saved, which has been translated to We Are Jaguars. And I think that's part of the message. What would you add to that, Helen? What would be the message for society and for individuals from this?
Oh, the message. It's really important to understand that we come from different lineage and we heritage different skills. We can be a writer, we can be a carpenter, but we also carry a lot of what our ancestor has been going through since many generations, and that is the collective trauma. So we also need, the most important that I see is to reconnect with oneself and really seeing where does this that I can't speak, for example, come from? Does it come from because I was a silent child, or does it come because in the third generation there was, on my mother's lineage, something happened and that put a stop of the communication? And I see that as I work with this living bridge, it is about also that the Western world, it has been like building a very high house of information how to be in the world. And today we have an extreme influence of how to be in the world. So how do we know who we are? That is a big question. How do we know who we are? And who am I really? Is this really what I've been wanting to do my whole life, or being in relation my whole life? And that is also because I see that up in the north also there's a kind of a grief in the tapestry of life up in the north, and that is also many people who are indigenous, Sami people, they also has been working with water power, has been working with mining, and century back, building up this system, and with the belief that it will be something that will be aligned with that. So it's a survival system also. So, but for me, the healing is to start with the relationships within, and also trying to see that how can I inspire people to really to dive in, to look in. For example, I have people who have been a part of the Finnish war now, and it has extracted a lot of people from the Sami communities. But the grief so it's also about forgiveness for me to see that it's harmonized and balanced about that, and also meeting people in their conflicts and in their anger. And I had an Indigenous woman that was extremely angry, and then she asked me, and she said, "I don't know where this anger come from." And it come from the lineage. So I think that what is the source? Where are we acting from? What is the source within us, self? But if we turn back to seeing, okay, Mother Earth, you are my source. You are holding me 24 hours. What does that mean for me? How does that feel within me? Even just being for a second, how many people are being today? They are just running in that. And also there's this extreme expectation of Indigenous people to be everywhere and nowhere, to extract themselves about their knowledge. And then that is the question for what is the intention with that? That is also a part of the colonizing. So it's really starting with the respect and the responsibility of how you act, you will be met. It's about having reciprocity. It's about giving and taking, to have that balance. And that balance is really out of balance today, I can say. But how can we find, I think that, but it starts by what is my own value? What is my need? What is my longing? I mean, do you want the world to continue like this? Where will your grandchild be when she's 20? So it's really, that's what I wanted to add.
It reminds me as well of one of part of the network of Vika, one of these very influential intellectuals in Latin America, Ailton Krenak. He writes in one of his books that humanity is spending more time creating toys for playing than reflecting about the real and important questions about life.
Yeah.
And this is the question that you're dealing with, kind of who we are and what do we need to heal. And I know Vika is a part of that network of knowledge that also includes Ailton Krenak. So I want to ask you, Vika, what would be your message? What can we learn from Indigenous community, either at the societal or more individual levels?
Tem algo que o Krenak nos lembra e que está presente na grande maioria das cosmovisões indígenas, que é sobre a nossa noção de tempo e como a noção de tempo é tão diferente para nós.
There's something on the Krenak that reminds us of the view of life of most indigenous communities, which is the notion of time itself and how it differs from the Western society.
Porque para o mundo branco, o tempo é sempre uma linha reta, né? Passado, presente e futuro.
Yeah. In the white world, time is always a straight line. It's the past, the present, and the future. E para a grande maioria dos povos indígenas, inclusive para o meu povo também, o tempo é mais parecido com algo como uma espiral, como um círculo. Então, isso também nos traz a sabedoria de que tudo que volta em algum momento. And for my people, for example, time is more like a circle, a spiral. And that also brings the notion, the knowledge, the wisdom that everything that goes comes back.
Então, se você planta mandioca, você vai colher mandioca. Não tem como você plantar mandioca e colher batata inglesa. Né?
Yeah. If you plant mandioca, for example, that's what you sow. You cannot plant one thing and reap another, for example.
Então, a nossa visão de futuro parte mesmo dessa visão que é muito simples. Não tem complexidade nisso. A vida é como a natureza. Ela te entrega aquilo que você dá para ela. Né?
Yeah, so our view of life is really simple, actually. It's just like nature. What you give to it, it will give you back.
Então, por que será que nos é colocado tanto medo do futuro? Eu acho que a resposta é óbvia. Inclusive, as questões do clima são tratadas assim pelo pessoal da ecologia, né, como se fosse algo alarmante, como se fosse um grande monstro, grandes extraterrestres que vão vir destruir a Terra. Mas, na verdade, quem destrói a Terra é a gente, todos os dias, de pouquinho em pouquinho, e não tem como colher outro futuro.
Yeah, and that's why we have so much fear of tomorrow, because the environmental specialists, for example, they're always with these big red flags about the environmental crisis and the dangers of the environment. But it's not the environment itself, it's we, mankind, that destroys the environment. And that's why we have so much fear, because we act like it's an alien, an extraterrestrial force, but it's ourselves that are destroying it.
No estado atual político do Brasil, muito está em discussão a identidade indígena. O que é ser indígena? Quem tem direito de ser indígena e quem não tem, né? Isso é muito discutido. E também hoje a gente está muito na mão do Estado em relação às nossas identidades. É ele quem determina quem é indígena e quem não é.
In Brazilian's current environmental politician system, it's the state who defines who is and who isn't indigenous. So we don't have our own identity in our hands. We depend on the state to say that what we are and how we are, what's our people.
E infelizmente isso está contaminando o próprio movimento indígena, porque provoca uma separação no movimento, inclusive do termo retomada, porque agora estão começando a separar retomada de terra de retomada identitária.
Yeah, and this causes a big split in the indigenous movement in Brazil. For example, the retomada, the land back movement, is now being split into land back and identity back. The retomada of your own identity and the retomada of the land itself.
E estando dentro do movimento de retomada, dentro das minhas pesquisas, eu percebo que essa visão de mundo branca, ocidental, perdão pela palavra, mas realmente se assemelha muito a uma doença que vai contaminando tudo.
Yeah, and with the retomada movement and my own research, I can see that this white Western worldview is like a disease. It contamines, it plagues everything, and... Porque
a identidade indígena está virando somente uma questão racial no Brasil, como se fosse somente sobre racialidade. E aí, para mim, que está o grande problema, porque ser indígena é muito mais do que isso. Ser indígena é uma consciência coletiva, é uma visão de mundo. E, parafraseando o Krenak, nossos mundos estão em guerra, e é sobre isso que se trata.
Yeah, here in Brazil, being indigenous is becoming an exclusively racial thing. And it's so much more than that. It's not just about your race, it's about a collective consciousness, it's about your identity, and paraphrasing Krenak, our words are at war within ourselves.
Então, muitas pessoas, como eu, que sofreram etnocídio, né, que teve a sua ancestralidade expulsa de seus territórios e tiveram que ocupar outras zonas, não têm o direito de serem reconhecidas como indígenas pelo Estado se não tiverem a assinatura, por exemplo, de 3 lideranças dentro de um território demarcado.
And for example, me and my people who suffered an ethnocide were evicted from our lands, expelled. We cannot be recognized as our own people without the signature of 3 leaderships within a certain territory.
Isso muitas vezes acaba sendo usado como moeda de troca por essas populações que estão em situação de vulnerabilidade, muitas vezes dentro desse território, né?
Yeah, and a lot of times that's used as an exchange coin, like you can use it to gain favors for other people within these territories, people who are in extremely vulnerable situations.
E é muito importante esse movimento do auto-reconhecimento, do entendimento da própria história, porque a retomada de verdade, ela começa dentro da gente.
And it's extremely important to understand this movement, because the real retomada, it starts within us.
E o mais importante não é termos um documento que reconheça a gente como indígena. Isso é o menos importante. O mais importante mesmo é a reconexão com a cultura e com essa visão de mundo que, para mim, é a solução do nosso futuro hoje.
Yeah, and having a piece of paper that says that you are from a certain people, that's not important. You need to have this changing your view of the world. That's the solution. That's how we can change Western society.
E é esse o embate que o mundo vive hoje para mim. É o embate de duas grandes visões do mundo e que escolham seu lado, infelizmente, porque é uma guerra, é uma batalha que vai durar muito tempo ainda. Nada está ganho. Alguns avanços foram conquistados, mas a batalha não está ganha. Muito pelo contrário, temos muita luta pela frente.
Yeah, and I really see it as a war between two views of the world. And in like every war, you need to pick a side. So pick it because it's a long-lasting battle. We cannot lose it. We have gained some rights, some land, but it's still a huge battle. It's not over.
Thank you, Vika. I think we can start wrapping up our webinar. I have learned so much. And I want to, this is a celebration of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous wisdom, which is truly wisdom and not just knowledge. And I want to invite you to underscore something, just one thing very briefly, that you have learned from your sisters in other locations of the world. And I want to start, and I want to take the cue from Patty, who said, let us remember who is not here. And I want to remember my indigenous origins that were erased from me, from the Aymara and the Pasto peoples, from where my mom was removed. And I also want to mention Angie Kuchimba, who is from the Nasa people in the Colombia Cauca, who is the one who has taught me most of what I know about indigenous peoples. So I want to remember those who are not present. And I want to give the word now to Patty for her to underscore and celebrate what we have discussed today.
What I would underscore from this conversation is how similar we are in so many ways. I mean, it's easy to see how North America and South America are connected, but when you look at the globe and you center the circumpolar region, I'm Caribou Clan. Helene is from, they're reindeer herders. This is the same animal. We're also connected. I joked with a Sami friend of mine that we were cousins because I'm Caribou Clan. So how similar we are in the way colonialism has acted on us, how similar we are in our understanding of our relationship to the natural world, to the other than human world, and the fact that it's alive, and the importance of listening to that world and listening to the silence and listening to the stones, but also similar in how divided our communities are. Between, wanting to, maybe going with the Western way of doing things because they feel they have to versus listening to stories. And all of that, it makes me feel less alone. Even to know that we struggle internally in the same ways makes me feel less alone. And so I really appreciate this conversation and what it's going to put out into the world. So thank you, Miigwech, for that.
Helen.
First of all, I totally agree with Patty because it's such a richness to meet you both and also you, David, of course, because it's about seeing that what I'm feeling is that internally they are centering and trying to split communities, trying to create war in between us. And we become struggling with our own identity. Where do we belong? Do we have the right to there, or do we have the right to be there? And I think these conversations needs to be more the sharing of the similarities, the sharings of that we are not alone, and especially among women, because I think that is under core voice, the women. And to see that, to learn from each other and learn also how are we interacting and remembering in different ways, even if we have kind of the similarities of how we are interacting with nature and how we see the extraction, but also how the worldview is. When I went to leadership for Indigenous women, there were 27 women, I think. The world really changed me because to see that we are not alone because sometimes in the world, I mean, the globe, the planet is big, the Earth is big, but it's like you say, Patty, when we turn it around, where do we come from? How are we interconnected with each other? And that is the beauty to sit here together with you all today. Thank you.
Vika, you have the final word.
Thank you.
Sempre que eu tenho a oportunidade de encontrar outros parentes indígenas, eu sempre fico curiosa e ansiosa para aprender coisas novas e específicas de cada cultura, mas o que mais me empolga de verdade é ver o quanto nós somos parecidos. E isso é ótimo porque possibilita que a gente se una, né? E a gente se unindo, a gente consegue, eu tenho esperança que a gente consiga fazer esse levante dessa grande guerra que nós temos para enfrentar todos os dias, né? Então eu queria dizer que eu me senti muito fortalecida pelas histórias da Paty, pelas histórias da Helene, mulheres de territórios tão diferentes, né? A Paty nessa dita América do Norte, nossa Abya-Yala, né, que foi mais recentemente colonizada, e a Helene representando esse velho mundo. Então eu sou muito grata por esse encontro, sou muito grata por conhecer vocês, e eu queria dizer que eu saio daqui muito, muito fortalecida e com a consciência mais afiada de que realmente é uma disputa de narrativa, é uma disputa de crenças, é uma disputa de visão de mundo, e que a gente tem que se manter firme e unido mesmo, né? Então, mais uma vez, muito, muito obrigada pelo convite. Auere.
Yeah. Whenever I meet an indigenous relative, I always get anxious and curious to know their stories, and it's really nice to see that we are so similar. And I'd like to thank both Patty and Helen for the stories from North America, Europe, land so far away from me, but who are so similar. And I can see that it's always a dispute of narratives, a dispute of views of world, but we need to stay united. We need to stay together to really achieve the change in this big war we face. Thank you for the invite and the opportunity.
Thank you very much. I was just saying we can finish the recording.